Before we start today's video, just a quick mention that we'll have no shows released next week due to me attending CrimeCon, but our normal schedule will resume the first week of October. Some stories go beyond being seriously mysterious and just become flat out terrifying. What drives people to harm and torture others? Is their humanity so far gone that they're unaware of the sheer terror and brutal pain that they're inflicting? Or are they motivated by that? Can this blind spot in human nature be a trait passed from one family member to another? I'm John Lordan, and on today's episode, we're collaborating with StrangeOutdoors.com on the tragic and thankfully solved case of the Australian backpacker murders. Between December 1989 and April 1992, 7 young backpackers went missing while hitchhiking between Sydney and Melbourne in Australia. At the time, the cases caused plenty of fear amongst tourists and residents alike. For the young adult victims, it seemed to be a case of simply being at the wrong place at the wrong time and running into the wrong person. The bodies of all the backpackers were all discovered in the Belanglo State Forest, southwest of Sydney and 80 miles west of the New South Wales city of Wollongong in Australia. The victims were Deborah Everest and James Gibson, 2 Australians who were both 19 years old. They disappeared in December of 1989. Simone Schmeidel was a German 20-year-old that disappeared in January of 1991. Gabor Neugebauer was 21 years old, and Anya Habeshid was 20 years old. Both were from Germany and disappeared in January of 1992. Carolyn Clark was 21 years old, and Joanne Walters was 22 years old when they disappeared in April of 1992. They were both British. All 7 victims had stayed in Sydney backpacker hostels. They had also each told relatives and friends about their plans before they left. They had all headed south along the Hume Highway, the 840-kilometer or 520-mile main road linking Sydney and Melbourne. Australian teenagers James Gibson and Deborah Everest checked out of their hotel in Sydney's Surrey Hills in December 1989, setting out for their home city, Melbourne, planning to stop on the way at a conservation festival in Albury on the New South Wales-Victoria border. The day after they left Sydney, a walker found Gibson's damaged camera on a roadside at Gallaston Gorge, just north of Sydney. The walker initially took it home. It wouldn't be reported as being found there until there was a wave of publicity about a month later after a discovery in the same area. It was James Gibson's empty backpack. His name on the outside flap had been cut off, but there was another place his name was written inside the backpack that was still intact. And James and Deborah were now missing. On January 20th, 1991, a German national, Simone Schmeidel, who was known as Simi, left Sydney planning to hitchhike to Melbourne to meet her mother, Irwine Schmeidel, who was flying in from Germany to join her for a camping holiday. Simi was last seen alive at a Sydney railway station, where she was catching a train out of the city. When her mother arrived in Melbourne from Germany 2 days later, her daughter wasn't at the airport to meet her, as had been planned. Irwine stayed in Australia for 6 weeks, hoping Simi would show up, but it was as if Simi had disappeared off the face of the earth. A German couple, Gabor Neugebauer and Anya Habeshid, left the Backpackers Inn at Sydney's King's Cross on Boxing Day, 1991, to hitchhike south to Adelaide, then north to Darwin, where they planned to catch a flight to Indonesia. When investigating their disappearance, police were surprised by reports that the couple were seen a few days after they left Sydney in a caravan park in Darwin. At that point, they would have already missed their flight to Indonesia. Later, when the bodies were discovered, the discarded airline tickets were found with them. It was 1992 when Caroline Clark from Northumberland, England, and Joanne Walters from South Wales arrived in Australia separately, but became friends and began to travel together. They wrote to their families back in the UK relating plans to see the Northern Territory, Uluru and the Nullarbor Plain in the Western Australia desert. In April, they left Sydney and planned to earn some money in Victoria picking fruit. They hitchhiked first to Bully Pass on the Pacific Ocean coast, south of Sydney, where they were last seen asking for directions to the Hume Highway. After that, they were never seen alive again. On September 19, 1992, two runners taking part in an orienteering event, a sport where racers go into unfamiliar territories with a map and compass and find the finish. The two runners came across a decaying corpse in La Belle Anglo State Forest in New South Wales. The following day, police found a second body, and the two bodies were soon confirmed to be that of Carolyn Clark and Joanne Walters. They were left near a network of fire trails which cross the forest and lead to sites with ominous names like Executioner's Drop and Miner's Despair. Joanne had been stabbed multiple times, and the wounds to her spine were so severe that they would have likely paralyzed her. Caroline had been shot several times in the head. The police believed that she had been used as target practice. Despite a thorough search of the forest, no further evidence or bodies were found by police. A year later, in 1993, a man named Bruce Pryor visited the Belanglo forest every week for 9 months, trying to locate further clues after the discovery of the British girls' bodies. The authorities had seemingly lost interest in the case, and Bruce wanted to help, and help he did. He wound up discovering a human skull and femur in a particularly remote section of the forest. He called the authorities, who came back out. Bruce Pryor's discovery led to two bodies being discovered by police and forensic investigators. They were identified as the Australian teenagers, Deborah Everest and James Gibson. Gibson's skeleton showed stab wounds, and his upper spine had been severed, causing paralysis, much like the body of Joanne Walters. It was starting to look like an MO was connecting some of these cases. Deborah Everest had been savagely beaten, with her skull being fractured in 2 places, her jaw was broken, and there were knife marks in her forehead. Earlier, I mentioned that Gibson's backpack and his camera had previously been discovered by the side of the road at Gallaston Gorge in the North Sydney suburbs. That was nearly 100 miles to the north of where the victims' bodies were found. On November 1st, 1993, a skull was found in a forest clearing by Police Sergeant Jeff Trichter. The skull was later identified as being that of Simone Schmeidel from Regensburg, Germany. Clothing was also found at the scene, but it wasn't Simone's. It was, however, a match to another missing backpacker, Anya Habeshed. The bodies of Habeshed and her boyfriend Gabor Neugebauer were found a few days later, on November 3rd, in shallow graves 50 meters apart. Anya had been decapitated, but despite an extensive search, her skull was never found. Anya's skeleton showed stab wounds, including one which again severed her spine. Neugebauer had been shot in the head. It seemed that all of their bodies had been deliberately posed face down with their hands behind their backs, covered by sticks and ferns. Also found were the remains of fire pits, suggesting the killer had camped there with the bodies of his victims. Investigators also found shell casings, and they were of the same caliber at each site. Beer bottles and cigarette butts were also scattered around, as well as more evidence of what had transpired, including duct tape, hand bindings, and nooses that were likely used to lead the victims to this location. The scenes where the bodies were found tells a terrifying story and raises some very tough questions. Considering that only one of these victims, Simi, was traveling alone, were there several killers working together here? Or was it one person that was able to terrorize the victims into submission? Most of the backpackers were traveling in pairs. 2 of those pairs included young men, and one of those men was an ex-soldier. How would a single killer manage to overpower all of these people and take control of all these varying situations? After developing a profile of the killer, the police initially narrowed the list of suspects to 230 people, then an even shorter list of 32, which actually included the man that they were looking for, but they didn't realize that yet. On November 13th, 1993, New South Wales police received a call from a man named Paul Onions. Paul was from Willenhall in the West Midlands, UK, and Paul could have very easily become victim number 8. He told police that 3 years prior, at the age of 23, he had left his engineering job in England to backpack around Australia. On January 25, 1990, Paul took a train to the Hume Highway to try to get to Victoria to earn some money picking fruit. And while hiking along the road, he came across a roadside cafe. As he was leaving the parking lot, a mustached, smiling Australian man walked over to him. "Where are you headed to? Do you need a lift, mate?" he asked. He told Paul his name was Bill, and he seemed a genuine and friendly man. Paul told investigators, "After we set off in his four-wheel drive, I talked about my family and plans in Australia, and he chatted about the sort of work he did. He was quite cagey about his job, and all he would tell me was that he spent a lot of time on the road." Bill stopped the vehicle close to the entrance to Belanglo State Forest, stepped out of the car, and told Paul he was looking for some cassettes under the seat. Paul felt that this was all slightly suspicious, so he followed Bill out of the car, using the excuse that he just needed to stretch his legs. Paul's suspicions started subsiding when Bill appeared to be doing what he said he was, looking for something under the seat. After a few minutes, they both got back into the car, but seconds later, Bill pulled out a black revolver and pointed the gun straight at Paul Onions. As Bill reached under the seat again, he pulled out a bag of rope. Paul unclicked his seatbelt and ran for his life. Bill fired a few shots and took chase. Paul was now being hunted, and Bill was quickly catching up. Within a matter of moments, Bill dragged Paul to the ground. Paul managed to fight his way back up and make another run for it. He headed back to the road and right into the path of an oncoming car, driven by a woman named Joanne Barry. Joanne was driving with her sister and 5 children. Thankfully, the car stopped, and Paul jumped into the back seat. As they drove off, Paul remembers looking back at the gunman, who was standing there with a grin on his face, a memory that Paul could not get out of his head for years. Paul Onions and Joanne Barry went into Balral Police Station to report what had happened at the time. They gave detailed information about the attacker's appearance, the information that they did get from him about what he did for work, and the type of 4x4 that he drove. But staff at the police station merely handed Paul $10 to get him back to Sydney. His report laid filed away in a drawer for years, a report that had the information that investigators of the backpacker murders were looking for. After reading newspaper reports about the murders in Belanglo State Forest, Paul called overseas from the UK to remind the police about his story and the assault by the mysterious Bill. The information was noted, but unfortunately those details were missed for 5 long months. On April 13, 1994, Detective Gordon found the note regarding Onions' call 5 months prior. Superintendent Clive Small immediately called for the original report from Balral Police, but it was missing from their files. Fortunately, Constable Janet Nicholson had taken a full report in her notebook, and that was located. This notebook provided even more details than the recent statement that came from Paul. Based on these new details and other investigative work, police finally zeroed in on a man not named Bill, but Ivan Milat, a man of Croatian descent. His father had actually immigrated to Australia, but Ivan somehow wound up very anti-foreigner with his views. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on December 27, 1944 in Guildford, New South Wales, and was the 5th born of 14 children. He was employed as a road worker. Police learned he had also served prison time. On Good Friday in April of 1971, Ivan Milat picked up 2 young female hitchhikers near the Liverpool train station. He pulled a knife, bound the girls, and told them, "I am going to kill you. You won't scream when I cut your throats, will you?" He sexually assaulted one of the girls, who then managed to convince him to stop for something to drink at a service area. With the help of people from inside a gas station cafe, the girls managed to escape, and Milat took off. He was later arrested, but facing both rape charges and 2 counts of armed robbery, he faked his own death. He went to an area in Sydney where many people have ended their own lives called The Gap. It's an ocean cliff that faces the sea. He left his shoes there, making it appear like he had jumped. Later that year, the police discovered that Milat had actually fled to New Zealand. He was rearrested in late 1974 when he returned to Australia after his mother was taken to the hospital after having a heart attack. Unbelievably, he managed to escape the conviction of both of the rape charges and the armed robbery counts through a series of police procedural blunders. Investigators working the murders also learned that both he and his brother, Richard Milat, worked together on road gangs along the highway between Sydney and Melbourne, and that Ivan owned property in the vicinity of Belanglo, and he had sold a Nissan Patrol four-wheel drive vehicle shortly after the discovery of the bodies of Clark and Walters. Acquaintances also told police about Milat's obsession with weapons. When the connection between the Belanglo murders and Paul Onions' experience was made, Paul actually flew to Australia to help with the investigation. On May 5th, 1994, Onions positively identified Milat as the man who had picked him up, threatened him, and tried to end his life, the mysterious Bill. Milat was arrested on May 22, 1994 at his home on Cinnabar Street in Eaglevale. Homes belonging to his brothers Richard, Alex, Boris, Walter, and Bill, he actually had a brother named Bill, were also searched, all at the same time, in a coordinated effort that took over 300 police officers. The search of Ivan Milat's home revealed a cache of weapons, including parts of a .22 caliber rifle that matched the type used in the murders, plus clothing, camping equipment, and cameras belonging to several of the Belanglo Forest victims. Milat appeared in court on robbery and weapon charges on May 23, 1994. On May 30th, following continued police investigations, Milat was also charged with the murders of the 7 backpackers. In March of 1996, the trial started, and it lasted for 15 weeks. His defense argued that, in spite of the evidence, there was actually no proof that Milat was guilty, and they even attempted to shift the blame to other members of his family, particularly Richard. But on July 27, 1996, a jury found Milat guilty of the murders. He was also convicted of the attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery of Paul Onions. Ivan Milat was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, as well as an additional 18 years without parole at the maximum security Goulburn Correctional Centre, an Australian super maximum security prison in Goulburn, New South Wales. Police also believe that Milat may have been involved in many more murders than just the 7 for which he was convicted. In 2001, he was ordered to give evidence at an inquest into the disappearances of 3 other female backpackers, but no case was brought against him due to lack of evidence. Similar investigations were launched in 2003 in relation to the disappearance of 2 nurses, and again in 2005 relating to the disappearance of hitchhiker Annette Briffa, but no charges resulted in those cases either. Many do believe that Milat had some help in killing his 7 victims, with one possible co-conspirator being his sister. Judge Justice David Hunt said after Milat's trial that he was convinced the killer could not have done these crimes alone, and a juror that was on the case made similar claims after the trial. Milat's own lawyer pointed at both Milat's brother and his sister, who shared a house with Milat at the time of these killings. One key piece of evidence implicating Milat's sister were those cigarette butts found near the body of Carolyn Clark. Milat was not a smoker, but his sister was. Police said they interviewed the sister on several occasions, but had no reason to believe that she was directly involved. In December of 2017, Ivan Milat tried unsuccessfully to appeal his convictions for the 7th time, and he remained in the Supermax prison in New South Wales. Ivan died in Long Bay Jail's hospital wing in New South Wales from terminal esophagus and stomach cancer around 4 a.m. on Sunday, October 27, 2019. He was 74 years old at the time of his death. The families of some of his victims hoped for a deathbed confession to bring some form of closure, but Ivan Milat categorically denied being the backpacker murderer when asked again by his family in his dying days. He said that he didn't need a priest because he had nothing to confess about. To his dying days, Milat showed no remorse, despite overwhelming evidence and several failed appeals. But considering the evidence, it does leave the question of others being involved. Could this level of evil run in the family? Another occurrence would lead many to say that that is certainly possible. In 2012, Milat's great-nephew, Matthew Milat, and his friend Cohen Klein were sentenced to decades in prison for the murder of a man named David Ochterlony. It happened in 2010 on David's 17th birthday. Matthew Milat and Cohen Klein lured David into the very same forest where Ivan Milat had killed and buried his victims, Belanglo State Forest, under the guise that they were going to celebrate David's birthday together. Matthew Milat then struck David with a double-headed axe as Klein recorded the attack using his mobile phone. News reports state that despite Matthew only being a toddler when his great-uncle was found and convicted, Ivan and his terrible exploits had somehow become legendary within the family. When asked why he had done this, Matthew said, "You know me, you know my family, you know the last name Milat. I did what they do." He was sentenced to 43 years in prison, and he won't be eligible for parole until 2042. In recent years, with the explosion of social media on these cases, other families have stepped forward wondering if Ivan Milat's responsible for their missing loved ones. The cases of Debbie Ashby, Kay Doherty, and Tony Kavanaugh have each been discussed as being possibly associated to Ivan Milat, and perhaps someday we'll find out that that is indeed the case. There is now a memorial centralized from the locations of where the backpackers' remains were all found. It's called the Belanglo Victims Forest Memorial. A plaque was placed there in 1994 with each victim's name to honor those lives brutally taken. I also found a somewhat disturbing image when looking into this case. At the entrance to the Belanglo State Forest is a green sign that welcomes visitors. A cluster of bullet strikes between the words state and forest. And below that, a small but appropriate message. It simply reads, "Please be careful." Do you have any insights? Or even a case you'd like to suggest? Feel free to send it to me. You'll find a comment form and case submission link at LordanArts.com, or you can follow and message me on Twitter at LordanArts. Thank you, news.com.au, Herald Sun, independent.co.uk, Daily Mail, grunge.com, smh.co.au, and Wikipedia for information contributing to today's story. This episode was written by strangeoutdoors.com and John Lordan. Please visit strangeoutdoors.com for many more mysteries, and I want to thank them again for collaborating on today's episode. Please join me again soon as we continue looking into the seriously mysterious.